When we price stock, we are always looking at the present value of the future dividends. And we want to look at a couple of different scenarios here on how those dividends grow. We can come up with a couple of basic models for pricing stock. And the first one we talk about is constant dividends or zero dividend growth. And this is actually a good way to price preferred stock. If the dividends are constant, then they basically are a perpetuity because stock never matures. It goes on forever and ever in theory. And so we can use the perpetuity present value formula to come up with our pricing formula. The present value of a perpetuity of payments C that happen every year is just C divided by the required return per year. That tells you the present value of that perpetuity. Well, we can move that over into the world of stock and just change present value over to P sub 0, meaning the price today, is equal to D, the amount of that annual dividend, divided by R, the amount of annual required return. And note that R must be greater than 0. Why must R be greater than 0? Because stock prices are never negative. Limited liability requires that stock prices always be 0 or higher. And so an R below 0 would cause P0 to be negative. Now let's see what we can do with this formula. First of all, I'm going to prove to you that this is a working formula for pricing something that goes on forever. Let's just multiply both sides by R. And we get D is equal to R times P sub 0. And so basically we're saying if you invest this amount at the beginning at this required rate of return, you'll get this amount of dividend every year. Think about this. What if I put $100 into an account that pays 5% every year? That's going to give me $5 per year. If I pull that money out at the end of the year, I have $100 to start the next year. And once again, I can make another $5. I pull that $5 out at the end of the year, and once again, I have $100, and I can let it ride for another year, and I can just keep taking that out forever and ever, $5 per year. And that's what's really going on here. We're investing P sub 0 in this stock today at a return of R, and every year we get D as a result. Now the more useful formula for this is R is equal to D over P0. What did I do there? I divided both sides by P0 here. And this tells me that the required return on a preferred stock is the dividend divided by the current price. And this is what's actually used by traders to determine the dividend yield on preferred stocks. What they do is they take the dividend amount, which is known, and divide by the price, which changes daily in the market, to get the current required return. Now let's talk about how to price a stock with a constantly growing dividend. We have a model for this already with the growing perpetuity, because after all, stocks go on forever and ever in theory. All we have to do is take this formula for the present value of a growing perpetuity and turn it into a formula for pricing this stock. Notice that this time the C has a 1 on it, a sub 1. And the reason is that we have to, because the cash payments are growing at a constant rate, we have to designate which one we're talking about here, because C2 is different from C1 is different from C3 and so forth, because they're constantly growing. And down here on the bottom, we have G, which is the growth rate, the rate at which this cash flow is growing. Now let's take that thinking over to our constant dividend growth stock. Instead of saying present value, we're going to say P sub 0, because after all, the price or value of the stock is the present value of the dividend. So that's what we're looking at here is present value. And I'm going to change C1 into D1 because after all, the cash flows we receive from owning stock are dividends. I'm going to divide by R minus G. And I'm going to say that R has to be greater than G here for two reasons. If r were equal to g, the bottom would be 0. And if you ask a mathematician about dividing by 0, they will say it is undefined. If you ask an engineer about dividing by 0, they will say it is infinity. Either way, it's not good for pricing stocks. And why can't this bottom part be negative? Because once again, limited liability prevents stocks from having negative value. So stocks either have to be worth 0 or something positive. And the only way we can make that happen is if R is greater than G. Okay, let's mess around with this formula a little bit. The first thing that I'm going to do is multiply both sides by R minus G and divide both sides by P0. Now we can just add G to both sides to get to a formula that will be very useful for you. This is called the dividend growth model or the dividend discount model. There are all sorts of names for it. But basically it says that the required return on stock is equal to D1 over P0, which we call the dividend yield, plus G. Now, if you've been studying finance for any time at all, you know that stocks have dividend yield plus the capital gains yield is equal to the total return. Well, what does that mean about G? It means that G must be equal to the capital gains yield. And what is the capital gains yield? It's simply the growth rate in the stock price. And so the conclusion that we reach here is that not only do the dividends grow at the rate G, but also the stock price grows at the rate G. Okay, now sometimes we are not given D1. We are given D0 instead. But it's really easy to convert because all you have to do is say D1 is equal to D0 times 1 plus G. Because after all, these things are growing at the rate G per year. And we could easily say that D2 is equal to D0 times 1 plus G squared. And we could generalize this to say D sub y is equal to D sub x times 1 plus G to the y minus x. So here, 2 would be y, 0 would be x, and 2 minus 0 is just 2. And so that's what we're doing with this formula. Now this is the generalized formula that you can use to find any dividend at any point in time for a firm with constant dividend growth. But it's even better than that. Because we said that G was also the capital gains yield, we know that the stock price is growing at that same rate. And so we could say that P1 is equal to P0 times 1 plus G. We could say that P2 is equal to P0 times 1 plus G squared. And in fact, we could generalize in exactly the same way and say that Py is equal to P sub x times 1 plus G to the y minus x. It works exactly the same way. Let's say you give me P at time 679, and you ask me to find P at time 729. Well, all I would have to do is take P 679 times 1 plus G to the 729 minus 679, which is 50, power. And that will give me my price at time 729. Let's look at PE ratio. PE ratio is simply the share price divided by the earnings per share. For some reason, this formula gives students problems when they see it in questions where they are being asked for earnings per share or share price. But the algebra manipulations are actually quite simple. Let's start out by finding share price. All I did was multiply both sides by EPS and switch sides. And so we know that share price is equal to PE times earnings per share. After all, it's price divided by earnings times earnings should give us the price. But what if we're asked for the earnings per share? Well, I can start with this equation and just divide both sides by PE. And that would give me earnings per share. So there's really no need to be concerned when you see problems with PE ratio. Now you know how to handle it.